Welcome, everyone, to week 11, chapter 9 of our employment dispute mediation course. This week, we are going to be talking about generating movement through problem solving and persuasion. And as we've talked about in previous weeks, there is a debate about whether or not mediators should be directive or facilitative. There is a debate or controversy over how involved the mediator should be in persuading parties to take certain positions or make certain decisions. But I think it's important to understand from the outset, with respect to our review of chapter 9, that persuasion is about change and mediation is about change. And so it's extremely important to understand that there are both appropriate and inappropriate ways to use persuasion. But remember that one of the guiding principles of mediation is that parties have self-determination in making decisions with respect to their own disputes, whether they settle, don't settle, and what the terms of that settlement might be. Part of self-determination is for the parties to make decisions based upon being fully informed. Sometimes when people are caught up in psychological traps, errors, cognitive errors, and so forth, that may prevent them from making informed decisions. And so persuasion in the positive and appropriate definition would not be the same as it would be in other contexts, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in order for a mediator really to be persuasive, in other words, to help people make appropriate changes, there are certain things that have to be in place. So let's talk about those for a minute. And I've talked about them in the past, but I think it's important to review them, particularly as we embark upon a discussion about persuasion. First of all, the messenger. Personal credibility matters. I have said often during this course that you must establish trust and rapport with the parties. That's why all of the active listening, the empathetic active listening, and those other tools of the mediator are so important, because at some point in time, the mediator is going to be engaged in helping the parties not only look at their perspective, but also perhaps look at other possibilities, other perspectives, including those of the other party. So personal credibility matters, establishing trust and rapport. Of course, the message, logic, data, and evidence matter. It's one thing to try to use your personal credibility, your trust and rapport, but unless there is logic, data, and evidence behind what we're saying, it likely will fall flat. Also, we cannot forget about the role of emotions in persuasion. You know, it's been said by social psychologists that feelings and emotions have been around millions of years longer than our cognitive thinking. Whether we believe that or not, one thing we do know for sure is that emotions were in place before this thinking, this logical, this reasoning that we talk about as being so important. Also, there are some other aspects of this, and this also comes into play with respect to the book I talked about last week on influence, the psychology of influence. Many studies have been done about what helps to persuade people to act in certain ways. The book by Cialdini on the psychology of influence has some very important information based in research, not just based on hunches. And one of them is the importance of reciprocity. Now, when I read Chilani's book, I was reading it to understand influence and understand perhaps some of the techniques and strategies that are used by salespeople and others to try to get us to do something that perhaps we wouldn't otherwise do. In reading Influence by Cialdini, I became a little irritated about the tactics and strategies used by salespeople. But when we talk about the use of some of these strategies as a mediator, we're talking about it in a completely different way. We're not trying to get people, we're not trying to influence people for our own benefit, but for their own. And what we're really trying to do is get them to think differently, get them to be open to realize that there are psychological traps that cause people to perceive things differently than others. In other words, not objectively, but subjectively. One of the principles that Cialdini talks about is the importance of reciprocity. Think about that for a minute. When you do something nice for someone else, generally speaking, there's a sense of obligation felt by the other to reciprocate. It's just a part of life. It's something that is ingrained into who we are as a people and as a society. And it also is somewhat universal. So we see that often. If someone, for example, buys lunch for you, this was an example used in the book. We feel an obligation to say, perhaps, well, I'll get it next time. Those acts of reciprocity come to play in mediation when perhaps fighting parties are thinking ill of the other. Maybe one party says something nice or a compliment. Then the other party might feel inclined to reciprocate that compliment and return it in kind. The same goes for when people are assigning blame. Have you ever been in a situation where something happens and people are talking about the cause or blame, and someone says, "Oh, I'm really sorry. That's on me." Oh, no, then the other person say, well, no, I also shared in that. I'm sorry for what I did as well. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes we can be exploited by our being gracious, but usually there's a sense of obligation associated with doing things for others, and this reciprocity comes into play in mediation. Of course, one of the most important places that it comes into play is in concessions. A party makes a concession, and therefore it's thought that the other party will make a concession. And as we all know, that doesn't always happen. But that takes me to the next conceptual part of the conceptual overview of persuasion, and that's the role of consistency. If you think about it this way, if at the beginning, during your mediator's opening statement, you ask people if they're ready to kind of roll up their sleeves and work hard to get their matter resolved, and they say yes. Or if you talk to them about the positive nature of mediation and somehow get them to agree that they're there and they're committed to try to get the matter resolved. If a party makes a concession and then that party refuses to make a concession, you might use the role of consistency and commitment in talking to them to remind them that they came to the mediation determined to do what they could to resolve the dispute, and then ask them whether or not by not reciprocating in a concession, if that is consistent with their commitment. I think that's a very, very powerful tool. Scarcity is also a persuasion tool. It's also something Cialdini talks about. And if you think back on it, you go into a store, you're looking to buy something, there's a million of them. You might think, well, maybe I'll get it next time. But there's only one left. That idea of scarcity is a powerful tool. There's some dangers to that as well. If we use scarcity in terms of an exploding offer, we'll settle for this right now, but if you don't accept it today, then you'll never see it again. That might result in a settlement, but it might result in an embarrassing loss of face when the party has to go back on that threat and renew the offer later on, or stick by it and perhaps pass up opportunities to have a fair resolution. But scarcity is a powerful persuasion tool. I think that it is especially effective tool when it is authentic and not trumped up. All right, so let's talk about conditioning the parties. Another thing that I've said throughout this course is that you cannot move too quickly into your bargaining and problem solving. Change, and particularly change of perceptions, takes time. And when people come to a mediation initially, they're often holding back, they're nervous, they're not sure what to share, what not to share. And so the tone set by the mediator has a great influence on whether or not the mediation will be successful, and whether or not the parties will in fact be able to change. So here's some things let's talk about. We've talked about those before in terms of your opening statement. Creating a seize the day atmosphere. Welcoming people to the mediation, thanking them for their presence, and congratulating them on their commitment to come here to work to try to resolve their case. Reminding them that, there are a few times during a dispute, particularly if it's in a lawsuit, where parties have the opportunity to come to a resolution. This is one of them, and you're confident that the parties are going to work hard, try to find a resolution. Now, about establishing deadlines, I worry about that. Natural deadlines are good. Parties have come in, one party's got to catch an airplane in the afternoon, or perhaps has another appointment. That's fine. I worry about mediators setting deadlines. For one thing, when you're beginning a mediation, you never know quite how long it's going to take as you work through particular issues or emotions, feelings, relationships. So I'm very hesitant to establish deadlines, especially artificial deadlines that are designed for the purpose of persuasion. If they're natural, fine, but be careful otherwise. Of course, building intimacy and rapport, trust and rapport is the most important thing you can do as a mediator. It gives you reserves of trust in this, what I call a trust bank account or a trust account in the minds of the participants. And the more you do to build and create a positive balance, then when it comes to making withdrawals where you get people to think differently, they'll be able to better do that. Now, here's another thing too. It's so tempting in a mediation for the mediator to treat this like a more formal process so that it's more of a presentation. Think about court. Attorneys say, Your Honors, in may it please the court. And then they go on with a discussion. Even talking to juries tends to be a presentation. Mediators must engage in conversational communication, not preaching. Remember, when you're asking questions, it can come across like an examination of a witness, or it can come across as being asked by someone who is truly interested in what the other party has to say. When you're conversing, remember to ask feelings questions about how people, rather than why did you come up with that, kind of an interrogation question. You're kind of asking them to share with me your thinking. Share with me your thinking behind your statement of such and such, or your position that's this or that. So again, when we talk about this, we're talking about friendly persuasion. Remember too, and this is important, keep the mood positive. And much of this connecting, much of this friendly persuasion can best occur in caucus. The thing you got to be concerned about when you're doing this in open sessions is that while you're trying to create trust and rapport with a party in open session, the other party's thinking, wow, they must be favoring this person, or they must believe them more. There's more of a effort, oh, were they treating me the same way? Am I getting the same amount of time? And you don't have generally those issues in caucus. So I would think carefully about where this happens, particularly in the domain of employment disputes. So this is a progressive model of problem solving and persuasion. Go back to chapter 7 in your mind and remember there was also a continuum of strategies used there in gathering information or expanding information. This same kind of thought in there being a continuum exists here. Remember, we're talking about self-persuasion. We're talking about trying to get people to be reflective and to move, but not because they're being told to move, but because they are inclined to move based upon their reflective thinking and analysis. So it's obvious, ask, don't tell. Remember that most of the strategies that we're talking about start with the mediator asking questions that bring the listener into a dialogue. And only in this continuum, if that fails, do we get more directive with explicit statements. So again, like I just said a few moments ago, this progression tracks and ideally harvests the rewards from the approach gained in chapter 7. It was that same kind of thought that went into the kinds of questions, the kinds of probing that were going on. Remember, in chapter 7, we're probing for interest, we're probing for empathy, we're listening to understand. Only after we go through those particular probing topics do we ultimately probe for sowing doubt or getting people to question their positions and so forth. So it is this important continuum. Now there's a couple ways that this is done. I'm going to go through these rather quickly because I think they're great information in our textbook. Role reversals is one of the best. That obviously, that's why it's presented first. For many years, I've used this with parents and educators in special education. When I've done training of both in the same meetings in special education, I will often have parents take the role of educators and educators take the role of parents in a simulation. It's powerful. And they often report the feelings that they got in playing those different roles. So I think that's important. Apology, of course, is important. Then again, like the progression in Chapter 7, we get to persuasion through problem solving, verification of interest. We're expanding in terms of identifying solutions, and then ultimately through feedback and evaluation. So let's talk about role reversal. And there are a couple different ways, to do that. One obvious one that I just talked about is saying, assume you were in the shoes of the other person, or actually having them role play being the other person. In the book, they give some examples, for example, getting them to think about how their own past statements may have been understood. Like, well, you said this. If you were the other person, how would you take that? Also, along with these psychological traps, we have these confirmation bias, selective perception, all of the other ones that we have talked about. But, we tend to, in attribution bias, attribute behavior negatively or positively depending upon how we feel about someone. So if we like someone and they're late, well, they probably ran into traffic. If we don't like them, or we have negative feelings about them, they're late because they're rude and disrespectful and don't care about other people. We sometimes think that about ourselves as well. But asking other people to step into the shoes of someone else, or even getting a party to think about their own actions, or thinking about, and this is the attribution bias, someone does something, they attribute it to bad intent or bad faith or evil motives, but helping them explore the other possible explanations for something can be very, very powerful. Now, one I really like, and I especially do this, when people are represented, but I ask them, what do you think the other side's strongest arguments are? What do you think John's strongest arguments are in favor of his position? What do you think John is going to argue to the judge? Or what do you think John is going to say to support? Getting people to actually articulate that causes them to think about what they would say or do if they were in that other party's position. So all of those things are, I think, very, very important. There's also something very closely related to role reversal, and that is considering the opposite. The considering the opposite strategy is based on the psychological traps or cognitive errors of overconfidence bias. People tend, as they become more committed to a position, particularly if they're in litigation, to be overconfident that they will win. I can't tell you how many people were absolutely confident. Cases go to trial because people think they can win. Well, obviously, someone's got to be wrong in their thinking many of the times. Not all of the cases that go to trial are that close. So considering the opposite is to get the other person in conflict to think of things in a more balanced way. And I do this usually by getting people to learn about, or I explain to them this overconfidence bias and some of these things that exist in that regard. Actually pointing out biases. Okay, so there are challenges with role reversal, and some people are just going to be resistant to it. But I will say this, when I do role reversals, I don't, unless I'm doing it outside of a conflict, like in a training, I can do it with parties together, getting, for example, parents to play the role of educators and educators play the role of parents. But when you're doing it in the course of an actual dispute, I recommend that you do it in caucus. In caucus, you can be more open. People are willing to be more open. And I think your opportunities for having success is greater in that regard. Apology is something that we've talked about. I think it's important to understand that apologies are powerful if they're spontaneous and if they're complete, but a partial apology can actually do more damage. And so we all know about that. What is a complete apology? It appears to be sincere, acknowledging either wrongful conduct and its impact, accepting responsibility, promising to refrain, and offering compensation. You often see those missing. For example, this may or may not come up on your screen in terms of something that you can click on and it'll play. But even if it doesn't, if you go to YouTube, you can look these up. Don Imus had some missteps and things that he said about a women's sports team. He at first apologized pretty cavalier in a pretty cavalier manner. When he really got a lot of backlash, then you see the second apology. An apology that I think is a great example of a complete and full apology is Michael Vick, the Philadelphia Eagles quarterback. Again, I'm not sure this will click on, but if it does, you can kind of see that in context. Then we get to persuasion through problem solving. And again, we're looking at the party's interest. We're trying to think creatively to identify solutions that will meet those interests. Now, if everything fails, and generally speaking, feedback and evaluation comes at the end of the continuum. You know, if we just haven't been able to get anywhere, we'll get to the point where we start providing some feedback and evaluation to parties. But it's a last resort, and it's important also that even when we get to it, that we refrain from being too direct. The way I like to do it, again, is asking parties to, when there are two things I like to do. One is to think about the other side's case. It's highly related to role reversal. But in evaluation, getting them to think about the strengths and weaknesses of their case or of the other's case. Now, one of the mistakes that mediators often do is that they start playing the role of the judge or the problem solver at this point. And after the parties get to this point in the mediation, the mediator says, okay, now I've heard both of you. Here's who I think's right. Or looks at a party and says, I think you're wrong. And at that point, you can really lose the parties. The idea is to get them to come to the realization, to have them turn on the light. So how do you do it? Well, get them to envision, let's say it's a legal matter, and you want to start talking to them about the strengths and weaknesses of their case. And let's say they are having a hard time doing that. They only see strengths, they don't see weaknesses. So then you go to the point where say, well, let's suppose that you're before the judge and you've made this argument. How do you think a judge will react who doesn't know anything about you or your case or your conflict? and you say this, or you do that, or you present this evidence. Another good, taking it a step further, is have them assume you were the judge, you didn't know anyone, and someone came before you and said this or that. With the evidence that you have here, what would you do? What would you say? You know, I've seen that before where in a landlord-tenant case, the tenant, you know, comes in, the landlord's taking the tenant to court for damages, and the tenant says, well, those damages were already there. And so I'm not going to be held responsible. And there's a document signed by the tenant when they moved in that says everything is just in great 100% condition. It's signed by the tenant. And so you're trying to do a reality check with the tenant in terms of what evidence they're going to present. And so you discuss with them, tell me the strengths and weaknesses of your case. Well, my case is really strong. I mean, this place was trash when I moved in. Are there any weaknesses in your case? No, I think a judge is going to just know right off the bat how bad this place was. Okay, now we get to the elements of the evidentiary problem. Say, okay, well, if you're the judge, tell me what you're going to show the judge. Do you have any pictures? No, I don't have any pictures. The other side, how would you respond to this? I'm just noticing that you signed this statement. Tell me about that statement. Now, again, what you're trying to do is slowly get people to look in an objective way, more objective way, to the evidence and let them come to the conclusion instead of you suggesting what that conclusion should be. And the last one here, asking one party to respond to another party's legal arguments, is another example of that. So, again, if these things fail, then you can become more directive. Like here, these are gradations. Some people don't get it. Then you could say, well, you know, I think the court may have a problem with that. I'm not sure the court would accept that. Or ultimately, you could even give an opinion about what you think a jury will do. And I usually don't, you know, say a specific amount, but I might give a range. I might talk about the difficulties that the judge might see with respect to this evidence, or that the jury might see with respect to this evidence. Not necessarily what I see, but based on my experience in seeing other things like this, this is what other people tend to conclude about that evidence. A major difference than stating it as your own. Again, if you're providing effective and proper evaluation, make sure that it's concrete, that you're not beating around the bush. Evaluate only when necessary, and let me repeat this, in caucus. You do not want to do this in a joint session. You also don't want to just voluntarily give it. I would ask for permission. Usually the parties will ask you for your opinion or ask you for your feedback and evaluation. When you do so, be even-handed. Be careful about the way you frame these statements. Again, I'll go back to repeating this, using questions to sow doubt, avoid leading in rhetorical questions. This is just, and I'll tell you another important thing, and I love this, is using stories, analogies, and metaphors. Many people believe that when they are in a dispute and they are in litigation, that they will win. They somehow think that having justice is putting information into a computer, and then this perfect justice is spit out. And by the way, that perfect justice is in accordance with what they put into the computer, not what the other side put in to the computer. So I often love to use analogies like this one. And this worked with clients as well as with other parties. I'd say that going to trial and having a decision is kind of like participating in Let's Make a Deal. Most people have seen Let's Make a Deal, and if you haven't, pause your computer here, go to YouTube, and look up an episode. And what you'll see is the show's host calling people forward to participate in this potential to win a big prize. It starts out with the host. In my day, it was Monty Hall. There's a new host now. And he would show the parties three big, like garage doors or curtains. And behind each of those doors or curtains was a prize to win. There might be a car, this thousands of dollars worth of stuff, a trip around the world. In another one, there might be some that's okay, some furniture, TVs, whatever. But usually behind one of the three doors is a zonk, what they call a zonk. It's like sometimes it's a donkey. Sometimes it's a big pyramid of dog food. Obviously, something you don't necessarily want to win. Not in comparison to the luxury car, the boat, the yacht, whatever. And so here's where the game gets interesting and becomes like going to trial or having your case adjudicated. The host will say, you can pick door number 1, door number 2, or 3, or I'll give you X amount of dollars. Now, X amount of dollars is like you're in a mediation. That's the offer from the other side. The host or the other party says, I'll give you blank. If you don't accept what I have in my hand, then you go to trial. When you go to trial, you'll either get what's behind door number 1, 2, or 3. Even if you think you have the greatest case on the earth, very few cases don't have a zonk. Now, the zonk may be a little better than others, but there ain't no such thing as a sure thing. That's the point I'm making. Now, by using that analogy, people can see, and maybe if they've even seen the show, I ask them, people turn down $10,000 from the host to pick A, B, and C. And when they picked door number C and the dog food came up, how remorseful do you think they are? How bad do you think they feel? And of course, they feel terrible. How they would love to turn the clock back a few minutes and take what is in the hand of the host instead of gambling on door number 1, 2, or 3. And there are other examples of this too. Deal or no deal. When people go for the big thing and don't win. Another analogy I like to use is, I'll tell people or ask their attorneys, what do you think the chances of you are winning? Oh, I think they're great. Okay. How great? 100%? Oh, no, not 100%. 90%? Well, maybe 70%. And I said, okay, let's suppose that we have a gun. It holds 10 bullets. We put 7 bullets in. Or wait, no, we don't put 7 in. We put 3 bullets in. Just 3. There's a 70 or maybe just 2 bullets because there's 80% chance of winning. And then we spin the whatever that is that you spin. Now you've got the gun and say, now you're 80% sure you're going to win. Are you taking the gun to your head so confident that you're going to win that you're going to pull the trigger? I haven't had anybody say yes. Now, again, the question of whether or not you go for it or don't go for it depends upon what your alternative is. And it can be catastrophic, not usually a gun to the head, but for some people, it's their life, their livelihood. And so these are important things to take into consideration. Make sure, again, in reviewing this with you, establish trust and rapport. Remember enthusiastic curiosity. Be involved with the people, connect with the people that you're mediating for. Show them empathy, show them that you really care. And if you are authentic in that care, people will trust you. Then, as you go forward, use that enthusiastic curiosity to gather information, to expand information, to have a full understanding of what the issues are, the feelings, the emotions, the issues around not only substance but relationships. With that, as you move into persuasion and problem solving, use that same continuum and help guide people to find resolutions to their own disputes and problems. Now remember, when you're delivering bad news, for example, if someone just doesn't have a very good case or there are lots of problems, externalize your predictions. Be really careful about that. Don't say, I've got to tell you, I don't believe you, or I think you have, I see great weaknesses in your position. I like to say, I'm concerned that the judge won't see it that way. I've seen this many times, and I'm fearful that the jury is just not going to go down that path. I'm confident of it based upon what I've seen. Explain your position fully. Don't pull any punches. Remember, you're empowering people to make informed decisions. It doesn't help if you're so afraid of offending someone that you don't give them the benefit of your full evaluation and impressions if that is what they've asked for. And that's what it's come to at the end if you're at impasse. Encourage people by being positive. One of the things that I always feel is most important is that I don't like to give up. I like to tell people, keep working. Of course, if I believe that that is in fact something that may bear fruit. Assure people that concessions will be productive if you in fact believe they will. Now, sometimes confronting is necessary, but I never confront just to get in someone's face. In fact, I never get in someone's face, even if I confront. But I tell them that I would feel bad if I did not give them the benefit of my analysis and my experience and knowledge. Now, there are also a range of evaluations, and I'll let you watch the videos for that. But this is an important chapter. The last few are extremely important. Remember to keep all of this information in context with what you have studied before. Thank you and have a great week. Look forward to talking to you in our next live session.